We are live and recording. Thank you all so much for joining our live virtual event with Dr. Gretchen Minton for her new book, Shakespeare in Montana. We were recording this event and it will be viewable on our Country Bookshelf YouTube channel and on this webpage if you have to leave early. We are absolutely delighted to be here in this virtual space with Sharon Beeler from Friends of Montana Shakespeare and Kevin Asselin from the Montana Shakespeare in the Parks. Before we get to Gretchen, we wanted to point out a few things about this new virtual space. First, there will be a buy button on the bottom of the screen, so you can show your support for Gretchen and for Country Bookshelf by purchasing the book from us. We'll also be dropping some links to visit our co-hosts, Montana Shakespeare in the Parks and Friends of Montana Shakespeare, in the chat zone, kind of to the right of your video screen. If you have any questions for Gretchen, just click the Ask a Question button down at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to those as time allows. You can also see questions other folks have asked and even vote on which questions you'd like most to hear the answer to. You can also leave comments in that chat window to the right. If you run into any tech issues along the way, we recommend you first try refreshing your browser. If that doesn't work, you can also try switching to the Google Chrome browser. If you're having trouble with sound issues, we definitely recommend trying headphones. They do often sort of fix those sorts of sound problems. We would like to remind you that this is a shared creative space, that we want to remain safe for everyone and ask that you be respectful of everyone who has joined us tonight. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sharon Beeler from Friends of Montana Shakespeare to introduce Gretchen.
I'm happy to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Gretchen Minton. Since her arrival at MSU in 2006, Gretchen has made herself into Montana's preeminent Shakespeare scholar. As a member of the English department and chair of the graduate division, she has worked with countless students and faculty, advocating for Shakespeare studies and guiding young scholars as they negotiate the Bard's writing. As dramaturg for MSIP, she has helped actors and staff deepen their understanding of the stories they tell. As a writer and director, she has interpreted Shakespeare in the Montana setting. As a respected Shakespearean, she has represented Montana at conferences and workshops throughout the world, drawing actors and international scholars to our state. As the coordinator of Shakespeare 400, she enlivened the Bozeman area community with lectures, performances, and activities in commemoration of 400 years since Shakespeare's death. And as an innovator, she programmed and taught Shakespeare's plays to prisoners at the state penitentiary in Deer Lodge, the first program of its type in Montana. In short, Gretchen has blended her love of Shakespeare and Montana in numerous ways that have fortuitously culminated in the publication of her book, Shakespeare in Montana, about which we are privileged to hear her speak today. Gretchen, it's all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Sharon. So I am going to share my PowerPoint now. One moment, this was not supposed to happen. Hang on. There we are. Okay, sorry for that. So many challenges of technology these days. Thank you, Sharon, for that introduction. I'd also like to thank the Country Bookshelf and Friends of Montana Shakespeare in the Parks for co-hosting this event. Shakespeare, in fact, wrote for the page as well as the stage. I've always liked to have a leg in both worlds, the world of Shakespeare books and Shakespeare performance. So it seems especially appropriate to have this co-sponsorship to talk about my book. I would like to begin, in fact, by just reading a short passage from the very first chapter of my book to set the stage. In 1980, Joel Janke had just taken over as the artistic director of Montana's Shakespeare in the Parks, an outreach organization of Montana State University that had begun in 1973 with the mission to perform Shakespeare's plays free and outdoors to communities across Montana. Already he knew that there was one place everyone always talked about, a performance site in the southeastern part of the state atop a 4,300-foot butte on state forest land, 10 miles outside a tiny ranching community called Boerne, situated in the Tongue River Valley and a stone's throw from the Northern Cheyenne Indian Reservation. For anyone connected with the MSIP, Janke's story of his first journey to Poker Jim Butte is legendary. Quote, "I was driving on dirt roads and kept getting further and further away from anything. And then there was that damn sign, Boerne, Montana, population 17. I pulled up at the general store and saw 2 kids sitting by the mailbox. I walked over to them and said hi, and then I asked, 'What are you doing?' They responded, 'We're waiting for the Shakespeare.' It's like they were waiting for the circus." At that moment, Janke realized that this was something bigger than what I thought I would ever do. The annual performance atop Poker Jim Butte has become legendary, for it exemplifies the rural outreach of MSIP and Shakespeare's uncanny ability to bring communities together to watch plays, even in the most unlikely of places. These 2 pictures show audience members watching performances at Poker Jim Butte, one from just a few years ago and the other from the 1970s. What you notice in these pictures, and in all instances of performances like this, is men, women, and children who are brought together to share this witnessing of a Montana performance. It is in fact the case that people like this are inheritors of a very long tradition of Shakespeare in Montana that began in the 19th century with the first white men that brought Shakespeare into this state. So now when we go back to the 19th century, the most arresting anecdotes that we find about Shakespeare in this period really revolve around the colorful mountain man, trapper, army scout, Jim Bridger. Now, Jim Bridger, for whom the Bridger Mountains here outside of Bozeman are named, was legendary in the West for many reasons. But one of the things that is really interesting about him is that he loved Shakespeare, despite the fact that he was illiterate. So although he couldn't read the books, he tended to always hire someone, usually a young boy, to read him the stories. Bridger loved Shakespeare. He peppered his own speeches, turns of phrase with Shakespearean vocabulary and syntax, and he couldn't get enough of the stories. At one point, when he was having a boy read to him Richard III around the campfire, they got to that point in the play where the tyrant king orders the murder of the princes in the tower. And Bridger was outraged that Shakespeare would have written, as he put it, such scoundrelism as that. So he took this book and chucked it into the fire. However, Bridger still wanted a little bit more Shakespeare, so he had to wait for a passing wagon train from which he could acquire another copy of the complete works of Shakespeare. Now, Bridger might have been the most colorful of the mountain men, but he was certainly not the only one who was really excited about reading Shakespeare. Trapper Osborne Russell in the 1820s gathered with other men in nearby what is now Red Lodge, and they gathered in these buffalo skin huts in the long winters, and together they read Shakespeare, Sir Walter Scott, and other classic authors, and they debated, acted out, had conversations about these books. This was a gathering of people that Osborne Russell half-jokingly referred to as the Rocky Mountain College. Granville Stewart, who was an early prospector and cattleman in Montana, also absolutely loved Shakespeare. At one point, he traveled 150 miles on horseback in order to acquire 5 precious books, including an illustrated copy of Shakespeare. But Granville didn't just keep the books for himself. He was interested in sharing them with others. So when he was a cattleman in eastern Montana, he shared the wealth of books with the cowpunchers with whom he was working. This caused a bit of a problem, though, because the cook became offended that these men were much more excited about reading books than they were about his grub. Because of this, the cook ended up threatening to quit, and so the books had to be thrown into the Yellowstone River. The person who told this anecdote quipped that this was the first circulating library in Montana. The legends about cowboys sitting on their horses, reciting sonnets to lull the cattle to sleep may or may not be true, but stories like this circulated widely across Montana, showing that the romance of Shakespeare and the romance of the frontier went hand in hand. Now, when the gold rush happened in the 1860s and the mining towns came up, the people there were desperate for entertainment. So that need was filled by itinerant acting companies. Jack Langrish, an actor-manager who came up from Colorado, was one of the first to answer this call. His traveling troupe went to Virginia City, to Bannock, to Helena, and to other places across Montana, and more broadly across the West. They played Shakespeare for hungry audiences in these mining communities. Some of the favorites were Othello, Macbeth, Richard III, but really it was a pretty broad repertoire. He was the most famous actor-manager of his generation, but about 20 years later, certainly the most famous actor who came to Montana was German-born Daniel Bandman. He had traveled really widely across North America and China, but when he got to Montana, he decided he no longer wanted to be an actor, but instead he wanted to be a rancher. So he bought some land near Hellgate Canyon outside of Missoula, and he took up the life of a rancher. Area newspapers never ceased the excitement of covering the adventures and misadventures of Daniel Bandman as he attempted to raise cattle, to develop Macintosh apples in Montana, but also to do other quirky things like dress up in an array of acting garb in order to chase invaders off of his land. Another point, he raced other people to the top of Mount Sentinel, and he also had a tendency to challenge other people to sword fights. An incredibly colorful person who was always still pictured in his Jewish gabardine in this role of Shylock, which you see on the screen on your right here, but certainly loved making Montana his home. Now, life for women on the frontier was difficult for a variety of reasons, but there were many women who started coming and managed to settle and make Montana their home. Women did travel as actresses with the itinerant acting companies. So you see here on the left, Eliza Kolduck. She and her father were part of Jack Langrish's acting company, and she played a lot of the key roles for young women in Shakespeare's plays. As you can imagine, the largely male population of these mining camps were really excited when someone like Eliza Kolduck took the stage. They had a tendency to put together some benefit performances for young women like Eliza. At one point, gathered together enough money to buy her a giant chunk of gold that was priced at about $450. Perhaps it was this allure of being an actress on the frontier that excited a young girl in Virginia City named Mary Sheehan. She was an intrepid little girl who went to school in Thomas Dimsdale's one-room schoolhouse. Thomas Dimsdale, of course, was the author of Vigilantes of Montana. But he was busy writing the book and didn't pay a lot of attention to his students. So Mary Sheehan frequently played hooky from the schoolhouse, dredged out sluice boxes. She saw the hanging of the road agents. But really, she was excited by this idea of Shakespeare. Her family had this prized copy of Shakespeare, which they put on a decorative table at the center of their home. And they revered Shakespeare almost as if he was a holy book. And you see this over and over again in these tales of the frontier, that Shakespeare tends to travel side by side with the King James Bible. Mary Sheehan also thought that she should be an actress, so in front of her mirror, she practiced the part of Lady Anne in Richard III, hoping that she could be an actress. Her stepmother, though, put an end to that practice, fearing for her soul. Now, when women came to Montana at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, they were very interested in domesticating the place, making it a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more civilized. And so taking the cue from the women's reading groups that had started on the East Coast, women in Butte, Helena, Billings, Missoula, and other places formed reading groups. These reading groups had amazing courses of studies that took them through Shakespeare, Elizabethan history, but also going back to sometimes Greco-Roman classical history. They met in the drawing rooms, certainly dressed up very nicely, and they talked to one another, they presented on history. But in addition to presenting, they also liked to act out the plays. So the image that you see on your left right now is a watercolor portrait made from the Fortnightly Club in Helena of two women performing in Merry Wives of Windsor. And so this notion of acting out Shakespeare's plays and also throwing luncheon with Shakespeare-themed dishes and drinks was really popular at the time as well. There were also African-American women who had reading groups, and what you see on the right is a ledger book from one of these reading groups, the Dunbar Art and Study Club in Great Falls. And this is a reflection on a famous speech from Julius Caesar. It's the speech of Brutus, "There's a tide in the affairs of men." And this is a reflection on that speech. You see Shakespeare written at the top. You get a sense of women discussing these issues and what Brutus was saying about fate and fortune. What's especially interesting about that particular ledger book is this happened pretty quickly on the heels of Booker T. Washington's visit and lecture in Butte. Probably some of the women in this particular reading group were listening to Booker T. Washington, also reading Julius Caesar, thinking about politics. And women more broadly in these women's reading groups were certainly thinking about women's suffrage. Many of them were involved in these early 20th century movements at the same time that they were having debates about the modern woman in relationship to some of Shakespeare's more vocal heroines, such as Portia and Beatrice. Now, in addition to the women's reading groups, some women traveled solo or were certainly independent spirits. On the right, there's Miss Ava B. Walker, who was from St. Paul and traveled through Montana under the auspices of the NAACP and the African Methodist Episcopal Church, giving lectures about Shakespeare and teaching elocution to really interested audiences. Many of you also might have heard of the legendary photographer from Terry, Montana, named Evelyn Cameron. Now, Cameron came from England, so not surprisingly, she was also a fan of Shakespeare. And as she roamed the natural world looking for the ideal photos, she often had a book with her and her journal, so she would record what she was doing. At one point, she spent most of the day behind a blind looking for the ideal shot to take of swans, so she could get these great photos of swans. But while she was waiting, she read a bit of Merchant of Venice along the way. Montana is dotted with one-room schoolhouses, a lot of rural areas who invested in the education of their children. Not surprisingly, when it came to educating children, Shakespeare was a part of the curriculum, but not necessarily in the way that you might think. The most popular play by far in the early 20th century for educating children was The Merchant of Venice, right? If you would ask a school teacher today, have you taught your children Merchant of Venice lately? They would no doubt say no. It's a difficult and uncomfortable play for us because of the portrayal of Shylock, potential anti-Semitism throughout the play, and some really, really hard questions, especially in a post-Holocaust world. In the early 20th century, however, audiences tended to appreciate The Merchant of Venice for its Christian sentiments, for the beautiful eloquence in a speech such as Portia gives, "The quality of mercy is not strained," but also for that moral lesson that comes with the choice of the caskets between gold, silver, and lead. So children, quite young children, in fact, were performing and reading Merchant of Venice and debating about it. But it wasn't all serious performance. There were also burlesques of this play. One of the most popular was a version called The Merchant of Venice Up to Date. You see on your right hand of your screen now a little program from a 1916 performance of this burlesque in Dillon. And the action of this particular adaptation takes place in a high school sporting team. And rather than the wager being about a pound of flesh taken from a man, it's a pound of hair taken out of a football. This is a really popular play in this period, played across Montana in the 19-teens. But in addition to what you see from this, I think really is that in addition to reading or studying speeches from Shakespeare, Montana educators realized really early on that it was exciting for students to play Shakespeare, to dress up in costumes, to memorize the lines, to really own what it means to perform Shakespeare in your own landscape. This excitement about having young people really perform Shakespeare continues to today with a couple of organizations which I'll highlight here. One is the Children's Shakespeare Society in Bozeman. You see on your left a particular picture that's lovely from The Tempest a few years ago of Prospero and Caliban. And on the right, the Belt Valley Shakespeare Players also performing The Tempest in their own production that year. And this is Ariel jumping not amidst an island or an ocean, but in a very Montana landscape of a wheat field. The Belt Valley Shakespeare Players is an interesting case of a tiny town of 300 people or so just outside of Great Falls, but every year they perform Shakespeare, and twice now they have had the honor of performing at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. And so this excitement about performance continues among the young people in Montana. Now, when Shakespeare first came to be a piece of theater in a formal sense in Montana, buildings needed to be erected for the staging to happen. Sometimes they were hastily put up right after the churches. So again, in Virginia City, you put up a church, and then a couple of months later, you put up the theater, about the same time that you put up the saloon, of course. The People's Theater in Virginia City was a rough building, a lot of unplaned benches and chinks in the walls where cold wind came in. It was apparently a rather uncomfortable place to see theater, but people crowded to the theater every night to see the Shakespeare nonetheless. When Daniel Bandman first performed in Missoula, he complained that what they were calling an opera house was in fact an old livery stable that was built on top of a manure pile. So he was quite incensed that there was this damnable pestilence of an odor, and it was especially hard on the ghost of Hamlet's father, who has to be underneath the stage and waiting for his appearance in the first act of Hamlet. But by the end of the 19th century, and certainly at the beginning of the 20th century, there were many lavish opera houses built around Montana. You see the Bozeman Opera House there pictured on the right. There were many very great opera houses in Butte, which was by far the largest community in Montana at the time. But there were also opera houses built all over Montana. And there's a great point of pride in having this central opera house where you could bring actors in to perform all sorts of different plays, melodramas and music, of course, but also always Shakespeare. So some of the most famous Shakespearean actors of the day, people like Ellen Terry and Frederick Ward, Helena Modjeska, they would come first to Butte, but then they would go and fan out into these opera houses all over the state, a trend that really lasted until movies overtook this notion of itinerant actors who came in person to perform Shakespeare. As Montana Shakespeare in the Parks has taught us, though, you don't have to have a building to have a theater. You can perform against the natural scenic wonders of Montana. So whether you're performing in front of a mountain or in a grove or in a natural amphitheater created by rocks or in a city park against some sort of other urban background, Montana's landscapes speak really, really well to Shakespeare. And that goes for whether the performers are doing comedy or tragedy or history or romance. Shakespeare lives and works extremely well in these backgrounds. It strikes me as I think about our place in Montana, these wonderful backgrounds that we have, that Shakespeare is and always has been about creating communities in Montana. Communities of people giving standing ovations, showing their appreciation for actors like this, but also other types of communities that I've been talking about just now. This notion that people can gather in a drawing room of women discussing Shakespeare, acting out Shakespeare in schools, discussing the works in buffalo skin lodges in the 1820s. No matter what the setting has been, Shakespeare has always resonated with the people of Montana. And when I look at a great picture like this of an appreciative audience, I think we are all inheritors of this long tradition that Montana has had with Shakespeare. These are some of the stories that I've attempted to uncover in my book and have had a wonderful time doing so, appreciating the rich cultural legacy of this enormous and wonderful state that I've come to call my home. Thank you. I'm going to unshare so we can talk about the book a little more. Hello, Kevin. I'm still waiting for Sharon, I think.
Sharon's coming.
Okay.
She's working on connecting.
Gretchen, that was amazing. That was so wonderful. It was really, really, really terrific.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's such a fun topic to talk about. And it's just been absolutely fascinating to spend this, 10, 12 years, really, this book has been in the making.
I think it's so appropriate to be able to be speaking about it on, the day that we were supposed to begin rehearsals, for our 48th season. And what a great reminder of how important Shakespeare has been for this region and for so long. I was talking this morning with the Billings Gazette paper and talking about the relevancy of Shakespeare in Montana, and I think you capture it so well in the book, and it's a gem. So thank you for sharing that.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I've had a lot of people ask me, is it unique, this relationship that Montana has with Shakespeare? And it's a hard question to answer, right? Because I haven't spent a decade in all the other states looking at their story, and I'm sure every state has its own story of Shakespeare in Montana. But I do think that the stories of the mountain men and of the mining communities and of how early and how consistently Shakespeare spoke to people and settlers of this amazingly sort of large, expansive environment. I mean, one of the things that I end up saying in my book is that this is one of the largest states, not just geographically, but imaginatively. So it really took the largest of authors to fill up that space, right? So that's why you take, a huge state and a huge author, and together those, it seemed like a natural marriage somehow. Yeah,
and I think it speaks volumes to the character and the audience that we get to serve, the communities, the tight-knit families, how neighbors come together. I mean, the importance of literature in our communities across Montana and beyond. It's remarkable. I think it is unique. I'd like to believe, to other states. Again, you capture it brilliantly in the book and in your presentation. It's just terrific.
Yeah, thank you. Sharon, welcome back.
Yeah, hi. Sorry that took so long.
That's okay.
I wanted to ask you a question, Gretchen. What brought you to write the book?
Well, in one sense, because you hired me. Thank you. So yeah, when I arrived here at MSU in 2006, I mean, to a certain extent, there's a real question about, well, what does a Shakespeare professor do in a state like Montana? Like, it seems like I should belong in England or in the rare books libraries or other places where I do love to be. So when I came here, I wasn't ever convinced that I was going to have any way of making a relationship between where I live and the author who's my life's work. But luckily, my husband, Kevin Brewston, knows a tremendous amount about the history of the American West. So we would be driving out here on roads or exploring towns, and then he would tell me these stories of the mountain men and say, there's a story here about early people bringing Shakespeare across these landscapes in their saddlebags. That's a really interesting story. And so I was mesmerized by that notion. And so we spent the next 10, 12 years after that looking in archives and going to small towns and interviewing people and trying to figure out more about this. And of course, my work over the years with Shakespeare in the Parks has made me, think about the legacy of that company from 1973 until today. But what this book has really become this way of appreciating that's not the origin of Montana's fascination for Shakespeare, but this rich continuation of that tradition. And I just have found it a beautiful way to show the cultural relevance of Shakespeare in other generations and other landscapes. But also, how else could I have gotten to know my state and its history, as well as having done this work on Shakespeare? So that's what caused the book to be written.
Gretchen, can you talk a little bit about, sorry, a little bit of feedback, but could you talk a little bit about some of your favorite experiences, touring across the state, different regions, and, inspiration that you may have experienced throughout Montana while researching?
Yeah, there are a lot of stories. I'll start with a couple, and you guys can cut me off when there have been enough. One has to do with just books and the old books that we found at different places. So at one point, an archivist was taking us through the book vault in Virginia City at their historical archives. And she was saying, yes, I'm not sure what's here. I don't think there's any old books here, anything that would be of interest to you related to Shakespeare. And we're walking down, one of the aisles of the vaults there. And I see an old book there. And I said, I wonder what this is. And so we take it off the shelf and open it. And it's an 1802 edition of Shakespeare edited by Samuel Johnson. I said, how about this book? This is good. And there's a picture of it in my book, in fact. But just holding a piece of material history like that, a witness to, somebody had this 19th century edition of Shakespeare and had it in Virginia City, and it has ended up here in that vault. Similar kind of experience where at the Dillon Library, they have a Shakespeare club there in Dillon that's one of the oldest in the state. And the club gave the library the books that the women were using at the turn of the 20th century. And I got to look at these books that actually had underlinings and marginal notations that these women had used when they were discussing Shakespeare and having historical background and doing their own presentations for their other women. And touching those material remains makes you feel really, really close to that kind of history. And just one more anecdote kind of like that is that we went to the ghost town of Kendall, which is near Lewistown. And we went there because there were these newspaper reports from this gold mining town, circa 1910, that were all joking about the bank. So the bank had this advertisement that was a takeoff from Midsummer Night's Dream. And the advertisement went, I know a bank whereon the wild time blows. I know a bank wherein your money grows. So they had this kind of cute little Shakespeare advertising scheme. And then they were making fun of a teller at the bank because he was about to get married. So they were joking that, oh, you're probably reading Taming of the Shrew now to get set up for your wedding. And so all of these things ran in the newspaper. So we thought, we should just take a look at Kendall. And it's all broken down, just a few buildings remaining. But there we were, actually walking through the remains of the bank. And we were right by the bank vault, realizing that we were exactly standing where this teller was, and thinking about all the jokes that were made of Shakespeare in that period in a ghost town that really only existed for 20 years. And so, a flash in the proverbial pan or in the gold mining pan in this way, where there are still these echoes of Shakespeare, right? This echoes of the ghost of Shakespeare. And those material witnesses to this cultural history have really been wonderful experiences that I've had.
Wow, fascinating.
Fabulous. There are stories that you've got in your book that relate to marginalized people. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little more about those communities and their interaction with Shakespeare.
Yeah, absolutely. So in addition to the regular chapters in my book, I have what I'm calling interchapters, because they're smaller little bits where I didn't have enough material to flesh out a full chapter. But there were certainly stories that I didn't want to overlook. And one of them is called The Margins. And so I do talk about various marginalized communities. So one of these is the African American community. And I was alluding to that with that Ledger book and the African American Women's Reading Group. And of course, there were substantial African American populations, especially in Great Falls, White Sulphur Springs, Virginia City, and Helena. And so I have found some of those stories of women's reading groups, but also there was an actor named Jess Lee Brooks from Great Falls. And he went on to LA and became a very well-known actor on LA stages as well, played in a very well-known production of Macbeth. So those engagements with Shakespeare, I found and was excited about. I have been continually frustrated and troubled, though, by a certain silence when it comes to telling the story of the indigenous population of Montana and Native people's engagement with Shakespeare. Shakespeare does not seem to have been taught to people at Indian boarding schools. And when you hear stories about people and Shakespeare and the Indians in the anecdotes, it tends to rely on these stereotypical stories like, oh, the Indian was so frightened by seeing people kill each other on stage that he jumped out of the window and ran away, right? And we know that these are all tropes that white people told and that really don't tell us anything about in what way Shakespeare might have been meaningful to these populations. And so a lot of this book has been listening to silences and absences as well as presences in the historical record. And so aside from a couple of snippets here and there in some of the stereotypes I was talking about, I have not found the story that I would love to tell about Native American engagement with Shakespeare. But I always want to acknowledge that these were the first people here. And when I talk about, when Shakespeare was brought to Montana, I mean, he was clearly brought by white settlers who were coming in, and Shakespeare was part of that narrative of history. So I think it's important that none of us undo that story, and that we all really understand and listen for those marginalized voices, and that we pay attention to those absences.
It's so wonderful that Shakespeare is able to voice a lot of the sentiment that we find common among those marginalized groups, and that they can identify with too, though. And I think that it's great that you bring that to the fore in your book.
Yeah, and I can second that. You know, I mean, the years back in 2005, I think it was, I was on tour with Shakespeare in the schools, and we performed in Box Elder and the Rocky Boy Reservation. And we were doing The Merchant of Venice, actually, which you just talked about in your presentation. And, you know, Shylock talks a lot about his sacred nation, his tribe. I mean, the language that he uses is quite applicable and relevant to those, to our tribal communities. And equally, we've done a lot of work out in Lame Deer as well. And there's a deep connection there, I think, with language and the connection to nature that Shakespeare is so apt to present in his stories. And so there's so much opportunity there, I think, to engage further. And you could feel, in that case with Merchant of Venice, you could feel the young students lean into Shylock and what he had to talk about, and his language and his approach. So, you know, I'm wondering, Gretch, are there any stories that you wish you could have added into the book? Is there anything that you feel is missing that you would love to, you wish you could contribute?
Yes, that's always the question. I mean, some of what we're talking about, certainly. And when you do historical research like this, there are always moments you think, oh, I should have known this, I should have found this, I should have included that. I think just about everything that I uncovered, I found a way to put into the book in one way or another, at least in the notes. But one thing, you know, I talked a few minutes ago about the silences, and sometimes they're more kind of aggressive, intentional silences, but there are also a lot of unintentional silences. Like, I would be reading over these wonderful minutes books from the women's reading groups, and they would say something like, and we had a spirited discussion of Beatrice and Benedict's relationship, especially with Beatrice as a modern woman. And then it ends, right? And I just was looking at the book saying, could you tell me what you said? Could you tell me what you thought about Beatrice? And can you connect the line to women's suffrage? Right? I mean, I know that these women were educated, and they were interested in Shakespearean women, and especially articulate, outspoken ones. And I know these women were interested in women's suffrage, but no one connects the dots for me, right? So a lot of what's just frustrating, but I suppose understandable, is a certain inability of the entire story to be told just because of those gaps. The other kind of gaps that are really tantalizing is my knowledge that I'm sure there are many, many more stories to be told. Like, I think about all those one-room schoolhouses and who those teachers were and where the books are that were taught in those schools. I think there are probably people who have their grandmothers and great-grandmothers' boxes of books in an attic somewhere. I guess I should say to everyone, please don't throw those things out, and let me know if there's something there. Because I just see this as an ever-growing story. I mean, I certainly, in a huge state like this, in a huge geographical, cultural, and historical time frame, I've really only scratched the surface, and I'm sure there are other stories to be told. And so it's not things that I found and couldn't include that are haunting me so much as the knowledge that there are plenty of other things out there that I just don't know about yet. And I feel like I'm not done, and I still really would like to include that and to know about that.
We'll wait for the continuation.
Yeah, absolutely. Edition number 2. Yeah.
You know, it keeps striking me. It struck me when I read the book, but also now, that it's so exciting. We are all actually a part of the history. Even this event right now that we're participating in is a part of the ongoing history of Shakespeare in Montana. And speaking of historical events and all, do you think that there's anything in the book, does it hold any wisdom about Shakespeare in a time of crisis like we've been facing in 2020?
Mm-hmm. You know, that's a really, really good question and a really important one. And, you know, if I were researching this now, I would be looking for records of what happened during the flu epidemic here in 1918 and whether people were saying anything about Shakespeare, whether there were Shakespearean orations, funerals, and things like that. I've been thinking a lot about community storytelling and how theater is about that kind of community storytelling. This is a time of great uncertainty and worry for our most beloved cultural organizations. I mean, we were talking just before we went live about the Globe Theatre in London and how they're in serious financial peril. I know theater companies and arts organizations all over the world are in the same situation. What this has also taught us, though, this period in history is what really matters to people. You notice that what people have been longing for during the period of quarantine were books, stories, music, art, and ways to connect with other human beings. And, you know, we wish, of course, we were down on Main Street at the Country Bookshelf live having this event. We can't be there now. This has been our life, but I think it's renewed our understanding that Shakespeare is and always was about bringing people together. So, like, to get back to your specific question, what I notice in the book is that you can think of Montana as being a lonely place where isolated individuals are reading Shakespeare alone. I'm trying to remember any story when I actually said so-and-so was reading Shakespeare alone. I mean, I suppose Evelyn Cameron for part of a day while she was waiting for the swans. But other than that, even Jim Bridger was having Shakespeare read to him. Osborne Russell was discussing Shakespeare with other people. There were groups, there were communities, there were towns, there were people who were together. And Shakespeare and theater are always about bringing people together, never about fragmenting them and isolating them. So maybe the piece of wisdom that we need to rely on is that knowledge that Shakespeare is an incredibly powerful agent of community and our need to build a world in which we can talk to one another and share those types of artistic experiences.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
Whoop. Where'd I go? There I am. We do have a couple questions from the audience, Gretchen, if you are game.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So Linda Carell asks, what is your absolute favorite research story? Something funny, poignant, or unexpected while you were researching over the years?
I don't, oh, geez. I mean, I already told a couple of those, you know, like the ghost town of Kendall is certainly one of my favorite, and finding that book in Virginia City. But just to give a different kind of anecdote, and I'm not going to rate absolute favorite, but it's not been just about books and ghost towns and stuff. I've had the great privilege of being able to talk in person with a lot of alumni from Shakespeare in the Parks. You know, people who have recently acted with them, but also people who acted with them back in the 1970s on some of those first tours. And I do have a great memory of gathering with Rhonda Smith and Tom Morris, great, you know, very well-known Shakespeare in the Parks alums who were on tours many, many times. And we met in the Mint in Belgrade. and over a meal, just got them talking about what it was like to tour in those early years. You know, the stories about Poker Jim Butte, but also about Hobson Utica, about trucks breaking down, about crazy things happening, and the kind of oral tradition of these stories passed down from generation to generation. I'm sure Kevin has many, many stories too. Dead owls falling on stages during performances, things like that. And what I love is relating those kinds of stories to the anecdotes about Jim Bridger. Like I always say, I don't know if those things really happened in the way that we describe. I mean, it's great to imagine that Jim Bridger really did throw Richard III into the fire, but we don't have any way of knowing that. But what strikes me as really important is the need to tell those stories. Like, it's not just like one story about Jim Bridger and Shakespeare. They were told over decades by many, many different historians and compilers of stories of this period. And there's something about those stories in and of themselves that people love to tell. And the same thing happens with building the kind of history and community of Montana Shakespeare in the Parks, is that actors will get together and say, oh, well, do you remember the tour this year, or the year we did that, or do you remember that homestay? And, I interviewed Bill Pullman over the phone and got his take on some amazing stuff that happened on his tours. Had chances to talk to Joel Janke, to John Hosking, to other people really who were with the company for a long, long time. And they keep spinning, to kind of use that 19th century language, yarns on the frontier that are a continuation of our need to tell stories. And for some reason, our need to have Shakespeare as part of those stories.
That's lovely. Kirk Branch asks, you note the role that Shakespeare plays in forming community in Montana. Any thoughts about this role in this unique moment in our state and national history? He also says, Kevin, you can throw in here too.
Well, and I think I am going to pass that question to Kevin because in a way, in answering Sharon's last question, I think I did to a certain extent address that. So yeah, Kevin, if you have anything to add to that, I'd love you to chime in here too.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we just had an opportunity this afternoon before Gretchen's presentation to assemble the cast that we had hired. We hired our actors back in January, December, and so we brought everybody together because we wanted to just share in the opportunity and the experience to assemble, to test a little bit of the language. Gretchen did. She's been working with me on this brilliant adaptation of Cymbeline that we were going to produce this summer, which we will produce next year for 2021. And so for me, and I know for a lot of our communities, when we reached out, Susan Miller, our director of marketing and outreach, communicated with all of our tour coordinators. Every community we go to, we have somebody there who works to bring us in. They market, they work to assemble their communities, and then we come in, we partner with them, we come into town to share these amazing productions. And, there was a great sadness from a lot of the communities that we spoke with about having to postpone our season, because what they spoke about was how important Shakespeare in the Parks and Shakespeare in general and theater, for that matter, is to the communities, to bring neighbors, to bring families, to bring neighboring communities together, to share in this unified cultural experience where there is such deep relevancy within Montana, and the connection to Shakespeare's language stories, which is why he is very much alive today, particularly for Montana and beyond. It's important for us as an organization to identify ways in which we can continue to further the mission in this time of not being able to assemble. And so I hope this is answering Kirk's question well enough, but we have to find a way to continue to engage in some way. And if it is through this virtual modality, then this is what we have to do. To sit and stall and wait for a vaccine, I think, would be harmful to the craft, to cultural arts in general, and to the responsibility that we have to our community to engage, to share, and to bring this type of material and quality to their living rooms. If that's the case, we're going to bring it to their living rooms. Educationally, also finding ways to continue to develop curriculum in which we can engage students and teachers with Shakespeare, and with relevant course curriculum that would be interactive and fun for them to engage in. So it's really, really important. We just did an interview this morning with the Billings Gazette, and the reporter asked me, she said, "Have you heard about this book, Station 11? And Gretchen has lent me the copy, and it speaks about a dystopian world where what is left is a group of Shakespearean actors who tour. And I think that that's a really important point to be made, that in the end, we need art. And we need it to uplift communities, to unite communities, and to provide a reflection, a mirror, right? Because that's what art does. It is a mirror to humanity and nature. And so I hope that answers your question, Kirk. Really appreciate you asking it.
And if I just tag on to come at it from from the historical angle too, is I think that probably most of you have been reading all of these articles written about what did Shakespeare do during the plague? Did he write King Lear during the plague? And this, that, and the other. And we could split hairs about that, but the important thing to realize is that Shakespeare himself was always living during plague time. It was not just something that happened one year. Right, he was born around the time of a horrible plague that wiped out a significant population of Stratford, where he was born, and then his entire life it would be, the plague would flare up, and then it would go down for a couple of years, or sometimes just a couple of weeks, and then they would close the theaters, and then it would get better, and then it would get worse, and so on and so on. So people have lived through crises and plague times before that have been extraordinarily devastating and horrific, but art didn't die then, all right? There was a bad plague in London when Shakespeare was writing for those theaters, but the theaters did reopen and more art was made and people came and they shared in this, and certainly people needed it, and it was vital to what they really sought for their comfort and their entertainment. And I see no reason why that will not always continue to be the place, the way things are in continuation of our own difficult moment in history.
Yeah, and I'd love to just draw attention to Alice made a comment that there's a beautiful defense of live theater from the Guthrie, the artistic director, put together a brilliant statement about the importance of theater and how we will return to it. I encourage people to look at that link. It's moving. It's really talks about the Greeks and how important it was to them, and so that's a really good link to look at.
Great.
Excellent. Let's see, where did that go? Michael and Betty Wainwright comment first. This has been fascinating. They would like to hear Dr. Minton and the panel's thoughts on what the future of Shakespeare might look like in our state.
I mean, it's always, we're already creating new things in this period. About a month ago, I did a Zoom reading with my actors in an adaptation of Timon of Athens that is set in Butte. It's called Timon of Anaconda. And we created that in the new Zoom format that so many artists have been using. And then Kevin was talking about how the actors are going to be reading Cymbeline on Friday in an attempt to get together that cast and really speak the words to one another. So already we're seeing a different way. No one knew a Zoom reading was really a thing until a couple months ago, right? And so we're getting used to that. I think we'll always be reflecting upon that, but it's hard to predict whether when we go forward, every live performance is also going to make Shakespeare into something different. I would suspect probably so, because Shakespeare is endlessly malleable and he has meant something different to every generation, to every country, to every region, to every person. And so the wonderful thing about Shakespeare is he's so adaptable. So as we need to adapt to new situations, and new challenges, Shakespeare will be along with us. There's no doubt about that. Sharon or Kevin want to add to that?
That sounds very logical and very reasonable. I think that as long as there are people like us around, and organizations like Shakespeare in the Parks and the Friends of Shakespeare in the Parks and the Children's Acting Theater and all of the other acting companies that are in Bozeman and other parts of Montana, as long as those are all still in existence, there will be good art and there will be good stage productions. I think we're all so devoted to it and so passionate about it that it can't die. It just can't.
Yeah, and we as an organization, when this all began, we immediately began discussing contingency plans that we can have in place in the event that we're given an opportunity to, I love this comment, live theater will rise like the phoenix. And so we're prepared to rise like the phoenix. That's what we have to continue to do. And similar to what Gretchen was talking about in terms of how flexible Shakespeare is, we're fortunate as an organization to equally be nimble and flexible. The thing that I'm most proud about, and I know that we all are with Shakespeare in the Parks, is that though we, exist under the umbrella of MSU, we are owned by the communities that we serve. They support us so that we can bring these programs free to communities across the 5-state region. And so because of that tremendous support and because of their continued commitment to our mission, we are able to be flexible and nimble and ready to, we have a portable stage, we have a great trailer, we have a truck, we have a group of actors here in Bozeman and beyond, and we can produce within a matter of weeks and get out when we are given the clearance to be sure that both our artists and our communities are safe, and that we're taking the right kind of steps to be prepared for that. So I have great optimism about the future of what we do, and I do think that it will be stronger in the end. And I think that the appreciation and the leaning into Shakespeare and live theater will be much stronger than it has ever been, because people are going to be reminded of how important and how amazing it is to assemble families and neighbors and communities together, to be together in one space, to share in a cultural experience. I don't think we really know what that is until it's gone. And when we revisit it, when it comes back, I think we're all going to sit out there and be like, oh my God, this was so important to our souls and to our levity. And so I am sad in the moment where we are right now, but I have great optimism about where we can be in the future.
Thank you. Well, I noticed that we are about at 6 o'clock. So I want to say thank you so much to Gretchen for a fantastic look into Shakespeare in Montana. As a reminder, you can purchase a signed copy of Gretchen's book by clicking the buy button on the bottom of your screen. If you're itching for more Shakespeare, please check out the Montana Shakespeare in the Parks virtual presentation of Cymbeline this Friday on May 22nd at 3 p.m. You can find more info on that on their Facebook page. We hope you'll support Friends of Montana Shakespeare and Montana Shakespeare in the Park in the future as that all evolves and changes or stays the same. You can find the donation information on their websites that was dropped into the chat window and also flashed along the bottom of the screen over the course of the presentation. We so appreciate you joining us all tonight and supporting Dr. Gretchen Minton and Shakespeare in Montana. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.